Hi everyone, welcome to my channel if you're new here. Welcome back if you're a returning viewer or subscriber. I have filmed 3 videos throughout the year where I have wrapped up the past 3 months of reading, selecting my 5 top books of those 3 months. I went to film my top 10 books of the year and I realised that I hadn't done the final quarter of the year. I could have just skipped this quarter, but what I really like about these videos is the fact that I can talk about books that I still truly loved but will not quite make my top 10. I still wanted to share them with you because I think they're worth sharing. This is like a bunch of book recs, but it does mean I've had to push back end of year content like even further. But after this video, I swear to you, we're gonna have all the books I read this year, and then finally we'll end on top 10 books. I was going to do a worst books of the year. I just feel like it's going to be like end of January by the time I get around to that. So for now, 2 more videos after this, wrapping up 2024 content. I want this video to be kind of short and sweet. I haven't taken any notes on any of the books I read, but I decided to just kind of go in blind. I'm going to be reaching into the recesses of my mind and trying to bring forth the original feelings I had for these books, how kind of excited they made me feel and how much I would love to share them and recommend them to you. Like I said, we are going to be choosing 5, but first of all I wanted to mention a reread that I did. This is a bit complicated because I originally gave this book 4.5 stars. I actually think I gave it 4.75 stars on my first read, 4.5 on my second read, and then this year's read was a 4-star rating. That is Fawkes by Nadine. It's a fantastic YA Guy Fawkes retelling. We're following Guy Fawkes' son. No historical evidence that he had a son, but there are some creative liberties that were taken. I just adore this book. I think it's fantastic. However, this year I decided to read the audiobook, read it via audiobook. I don't recommend that route because this book felt extremely YA this time around, and while I think that could be like a combination of the fact I've got older since previous read of this book, I think the audiobook narrator really kind of let the book down in terms of amping up how YA it felt. He put on voices for like the female characters that were like very childish. On the whole, I just didn't really like the audiobook route, but I still love the contents of this book. So this was a 4-star. I'm going to put it in here as like a little honourable mention. This hasn't quite made my top 5 this year in terms of these past 3 months. But yeah, this is a historical fantasy book. It's got a really interesting magic system. It's got some great characters and some real depth to it as well. So highly recommend Fawkes if you're at all interested in anything to do with the gunpowder plot, bonfire night, anything related to that. A bit more details about one of the biggest like historical events in British history. Starting off with book number 5, that is A Song of the Wild Built by Becky. This is a very short little book. It's almost like a novella in length, but it follows this character called sibling Dex. Dex is a tea monk, and that means that they go around to different villages and towns and things like that, and they provide essentially like therapy but over a cup of tea. They'll prescribe a tea for their client that matches up with whatever they're dealing with, whether that's grief or financial struggles or problems in love. While the client is having their tea, drinking their prescribed tea, they're also receiving kind of advice just through a conversation. This is a beautiful story because what happens is sibling Dex kind of has a bit of burnout in their job, so they decide to go off into the wilderness and kind of like touch grass, reconnect with nature, and really ponder the point of their existence. In doing so, they bump into Moscap, who is a robot. The robots have been separated from the humans because they basically reached a point where they were too advanced, so they went to the humans and were like, we prefer to go and live our own life. You can live your own life and we'll live separate from each other. So it's been many years since the robots interacted with the humans, but while Dex is like off the beaten track, they bump into Moscap, and there's this beautiful kind of like stilted conversation that begins based on the two's differences and also Moscap's surety of what it is there to do. Moscap has a very kind of like simplified view of life because it is a robot. Sibling Dex is able to communicate all these problems they're facing. Moscap is kind of blown away by how complex a human's life is. This is a beautiful story. It's so philosophical, so existentialist, but delivered in such a gentle, kind of wholesome way. It was just like a little hug, a little breath of fresh air amongst a very kind of capitalist driven world. We get lost in what we're meant to be doing and what we're really here for because of being surrounded by so much content and so much nonsense, essentially. That was a 4-star read. Okay, then we have another reread. This is The Assassin's Blade by Sarah J Maas, book number 4 in this list. Yeah, I love this. I read this in 2018, I believe, originally, and then I reread it this year because I'm in the middle of reading the Throne of Glass series for real, like for the first time all the way through. I wanted to do a reread of this because I didn't reread it first or third, wherever the options are of reading this book. I decided to read it 4th, so after Queen of Shadows, Throne of Glass, Crown of Midnight, Heir of Fire, Queen of Shadows, and then I read this one. This was a really interesting read, particularly because of the point where I read it. So that means I've done 2 routes of reading this book. I read it as the prequel, so before Throne of Glass, and I've read it 4th. And I like both routes actually. I did originally get spoiled for the final like very sad event that occurs in this book. That definitely tainted my first read of this book, but going into this one knowing I was kind of okay with that, and I was familiar with other events, not just that final one, because I'd already done a full read of the entire book, that didn't bother me so much this time around. The Assassin's Blade is the collection of 5 novellas. I rated each one individually, and I roughly came out with a 4-star rating overall. There was one 5-star, and then there are a couple, I think, of 3.5s or something like that. The Throne of Glass series follows Thelena. This book is fantastic at showing so much of her character growth throughout that series, because this is like her life was before the Throne of Glass series. So much character development throughout not just this book but the entire series as well. Her character really changes, but in a way that's not like, it's not like the author has written her character as like a different person. You can see this natural progression. A lot of it is through the kind of pain and suffering she's been through. I'm thoroughly enjoying revisiting this series, and you will definitely see quite a few books from it in my top 10 books of the year. Okay, moving on into my 4.5 star reads. Actually no, this was originally a 4.5 and then I lowered it to a 4, so not quite, but this is, you know, on the precipice. It would be, I guess, a 4.25 if I still rated in those. But this is 6 Scorched Roses by Carissa Broadbent. So this year I started a series called the Crowns of Nyaxia series, and that is a kind of like adult fantasy, or is it new adult, I'm not sure, but it's like a romantic series featuring vampires and humans. And within this series there's a duology called the I don't know, I'll put it on the screen. That starts with the Serpent and the Wings of Night, and then the next book is The Ashes and the Star-Cursed King. I read The Serpent and the Wings of Night, and then before you read The Ashes and the Star-Cursed King, you're meant to read 6 Scorched Roses. This is really difficult to say. I read this originally via ebook, and I read it on my Kindle on the plane on my flight to New York. I was just hooked the entire flight, and I basically got the entire thing done within that. I was just non-stop reading it. This particular book follows characters I think we're going to encounter in potentially The Ashes and the Star-Cursed King, if not, then the follow-up series from that, the follow-up duology. But in this we follow Lilith. She lives in a town which is, or a little village, which is suffering from this kind of plague-like disease. She's very much kind of STEM girly. She loves her science and her maths. Has this theory that vampire blood could be used within her experimentations to create an antidote against this plague. But in order to obtain vampire blood, she has to seek out a vampire who's living kind of more in the humans' neighborhood because of something to do with his past. Vampires obviously prey on humans, so this is a very kind of nerve-wracking thing for Lilith to be doing, but she's so driven by the suffering of her community, and particularly the suffering of her sister, who's very unwell with this plague. And she basically creates this bargain with the vampire. In exchange for a vial of his blood, she will give him a magical rose. The story goes from there. There's a lot to do with science, there's a lot to do with love, there's a lot to do with the way that people have different styles of love and the way that they kind of prove their love to others, the way that this character proves her love to her sister, particularly in this effort to heal her, and she's willing to sacrifice her entire life to put this one person before herself because of the love she has for her. But that's not seen in her spending time with this sister or speaking kind words to her or anything like that. It's in desperately like holding herself away to work on this antidote. The writing is really beautiful in this. It poses so many kind of interesting philosophical questions, also ones about religion and being bound to do something by duty, less so over the care of people. This world is fascinating. I just adore every single second of it, and I really thoroughly enjoyed this novella. I think it's very, very impressive considering how short it is, how much is packed into this, and how much it made me think. Next up, I finished off a fantasy series that I've been in the middle of for a while. This is a trilogy, and this is the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy by Stephanie Garber. So book number 2 is A Curse for True Love. I enjoyed it so much more over the rest of the series. The first 2 books were 4-star reads for me. I really enjoyed them, but I felt like they were lacking something. They were almost like 3.5 stars, to be honest. This series has a lot of hype behind it, and people go crazy for it. Like, this is just like 6-star reads all around for a lot of people. And I think the hype might have slightly put me off. I went into it thinking I was going to be obsessed, and I came out enjoying it but not being completely blown away. So the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy is a follow-on from the Caraval series. The two are kind of linked, so it's recommended that you read the Caraval series before this one. I love the Caraval series so much. It's one of my favourites. Pretty much all very solid 4-star reads, but the final book in that was a 4.5. But I actually preferred this book over Finale, the final book in the Caraval series, which is pretty impressive because the Caraval series, they're like comfort reads to me. I love the world, I love the characters. This was stunning. This had so much depth to it. It felt different from the first couple of books because of the plot, which I can't really get into because it is spoiler territory. But the first book follows Evangeline, and she's desperately in love with this guy who's actually set on marrying someone else or something like that. I can't remember what the exact storyline is. Basically, she goes to the temple of the Prince of Hearts and she prays to him that he would intercede and allow her to be with her, what she thinks is her one true love. Jax, the Prince of Hearts, does intercede, but he also creates a lot of problems for Evangeline, and he basically agrees to help her in exchange for 3 kisses at the time and place of his choosing, and also also to whoever he chooses. So much has happened by the time we get to this book, but the ending of the second book is so emotional. It creates like a rift between our two characters. They're forced to kind of find each other through the events of the third book. This was kind of laugh out loud funny. I thought the pacing of it was really great. The other ones have kind of meandered a bit, but this one had a bit more of a bit more direction. I feel like Stephanie Garber had just kind of honed her craft. This series is extremely YA, so if you're not really into YA books, then you might not like that. That's the only thing I feel like that didn't make this reach a 5-star, was the fact that it is pretty juvenile in the writing style, but intentionally so. It's just aimed at kind of different demographic from the one that I'm in. But there's so many good one-liners, there's so much truth and beauty and hope in this book, and I just adored every single second of it. And then my top favourite book of 2025, even. That entire sentence was a lie. My favourite book of 2024 in terms of the last 3 months, so October, November and December, was If We're Villains by Emma Rio. This was so close to a 5-star. It would be a 4.75 if I rated in 0.25s, but there was one thing that held this back from being a 5, and I'm going to get into that in a second. If We Are Villains follows kids who are all obsessed with Shakespeare, and they're in a Shakespeare course at an arts college. They get very, very caught up in their characters. The characters that they commonly portray throughout their plays are frequently the same sort of figures. So the person who plays the king is always the king, and the person who plays like the romantic lead is always the romantic lead, and the offsider and the pretty kind of promiscuous one, they're always the same. And this means that as well as them having been chosen for those roles because of traits within themselves, they also start to absorb the traits of the characters in the plays. Shakespeare is famous for his comedies and his tragedies, as well as his history plays, but that means that he's kind of exploring the range of human emotion, and that means that this book spirals out of control. We start the book following Oliver. He is our protagonist, and he has been in jail for I think 10 years or something like that, after confessing to the murder of Richard. Is that his name? I think so. This is a beautiful story. It is at once kind of like a mystery, so much more than that. Complex human relationships and desire and devotion. So it's pretty plot heavy as well as being very, very character heavy. What the author did is that in writing this dark academia book, she wasn't actually trying to focus on the dark academia elements. She was mostly going for this kind of character study. And in doing so, she did let the mystery element of this slightly drop off towards the end. There was a lot that I kind of guessed about this book was very predictable, and that stopped it from being a full 5-star, but I think this was a masterpiece in literally every single other way. I cannot recommend it enough. I think it's fantastic. So much that was written that was just so accurate to the way that people are. I loved how distinct each of the characters were. They were so different from one another, but they were also not kind of stereotypes. They were people that could exist, types of people I have kind of personally encountered. There was also one particular kind of like plot line in this, or storyline or theme that was explored, that I highly related to. It did make me cry because of how well the author managed to capture this specific thing that I related to so heavily. It's extremely complex and difficult to explore within fiction, particularly in such like a delicate, nuanced way. So all in all, this book was just a personal favourite. It really touched me, but also a really well written book, and I highly, highly recommend if you're interested in anything that I've mentioned about it and you haven't read it already. So there you have it, the 5 books. Well, our honourable mention is here, and we're also missing A Psalm for the Wild Built. I almost said The Prayer for the Crown Shy, which is the sequel. But yeah, this is pretty kind of fantasy heavy, I guess, because we've got historical fantasy, Some of the Wild Built is kind of like, I guess it's fantasy, it's like a sci-fi. We've got one kind of lit-fic mystery book. A really, really successful 3 months in terms of my reading. I was dealing with something pretty heavily within my personal life, so I'm impressed with how much I managed to get to and how much I've still managed to enjoy. Unfortunately, we didn't have any 5-star reads, which is devastating, although I think I'm very close to one with the book I'm currently reading. Give this video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it. Subscribe if you'd like to stick around and see if any of these books manage to make it into my top 10. Spoiler alert, at least one of them does. By the end of next week, it will be here for you. Let me know if you've read any of these books. Let me know if you want to read any of them. And I'll see you super, super soon in a couple of days for another video, which will be where I run through every single book I read this year and my rating on it, and like a brief little kind of line or two with my feelings / what it's about. Bye bye.